Alright guys, welcome back to another video. So in this video I want to give you guys my thoughts and opinions on the 5.50 to 6.50 jailbreak that is in private. So many people keep asking me about this in every single video I upload. There's comments under it saying 5.55 jailbreak when, ETA when, even these comments scrolling along the top of sce.party are asking about it. It never ends. So not that I'm going to end any speculation, I'm just going to add my opinions to the mix. So yeah, and of course take this with a grain of salt because this is just my own speculation, my own opinions on this whole jailbreak and why it's private and all of that. So yeah, take that as you will basically. So first of all, this is not a jailbreak. This 6.20 public WebKit exploit, most people know this, but there's a lot of people who seem to think that this is a jailbreak. It isn't. This was released by SpectreDev. It is simply a WebKit exploit. SpectreDev had a WebKit exploit on 6.20. It was patched in 6.50. Therefore, he released it because it was patched. So there was no point in keeping it private. And he released it. And it's just a WebKit exploit. So when we're talking about a jailbreak, what we mean is a kernel exploit. That is what a jailbreak is for the PS4. It's a kernel exploit or a KEK exploit, as it's also known as. So that is not what we have here. This is a WebKit exploit only, and that only allows you to do very limited things. So for example, you can maybe browse the hard drive through the browser. I think I've seen people do that on a WebKit exploit before, and enable the debug settings, but you can't install fake package files, and even if you could, you wouldn't be able to run them because you need the homebrew enabler, which requires a kernel exploit for that. So sorry, but that is not a jailbreak. So what we're really talking about here is the 5.50 to 6.50 kernel exploit that's in private. So these are kernel exploits. So it says that this status is based on the following public information. A kernel dump was leaked for firmware version 6.00 beta 1 from an unknown source but confirmed by trusted developers to be a legitimate dump. So it says a hacker tweeted out a 5.55 kernel string, which I believe is referring to this. This is the kernel string here. This can only be basically got from dumping the kernel. So that does appear to be legit. And this was posted way back in May 2018. And then it also says that a hacker tweeted out a 6.20 kernel string. Now this is a different person on Twitter, this guy here. Now that's not it, but this is the first thing he posted, I believe. And then a developer asks him what's the kernel string, similar to what this guy tweeted. Because if he posts the kernel string, that'll give him enough proof that he has successfully dumped the 6.20 kernel. So he posts that, and then the developer replies with the actual kernel string, which this other dev checks to make sure it's legitimate, and he says, yeah, it's legit, and it's been added to the kernel build string table on PS4 Dev Wiki. So that does appear to be legit. And not only that, but the 6.50 update that only came out a few days ago, this same developer has posted a kernel string for that as well, showing that he has successfully dumped the 6.50 kernel as well, probably using the same vulnerability based on how quickly he was able to do it. So it looks like the latest kernel is still vulnerable to the same exploit. So the question on a lot of people's minds is, why has this not been released yet? So we've got 5.50 all the way down to 6.50. They've all been dumped. The kernels have all been dumped, and yet there's no public jailbreak available for any of these versions yet. Why? Why are we still waiting? So a lot of people are saying that these developers are just being selfish. They're keeping it to themselves because they're assholes or something. And personally, that's not a good way to look at it. Because first of all, they're not under any obligation to give us anything. They don't owe the community anything. These guys are doing this just for fun. If they release it, that's great. If they don't, that's up to them, because at the end of the day, they don't owe us a damn thing. That's just the truth of it. You know, they're not being paid for this. It's not their job to exploit the PS4. So yeah, they're not under any obligation to give us a damn thing. I would certainly appreciate it if they did, but if they decide not to, then that is up to them. However, I don't think that is the reason why they're keeping this to themselves. I think there's more to it than that. So one potential reason, and I don't believe this is the main reason, but this is this could be part of it, is that because all these kernels are vulnerable to the same exploit, then they could just, if they did release, say, the 5.50 exploit, then people could just port it over to 6.50 because it's the same vulnerability, potentially, and use it to go online and damage, Sony's online service, PSN. Sony might take issue with that, go after the people who released the jailbreak legally, which wouldn't be very good. However, I think that's less likely. I think Sony would just release a firmware update to patch it and require everyone to be on that firmware version in order to use PSN, and then that would fix it really quickly. So I doubt that that's really likely to be the case. I think what's more likely is that this could be one of the last vulnerabilities for the PS4, because there can only be a certain number of vulnerabilities in the WebKit, in the kernel, that allows for these kernel exploits to be done. And every time these developers release a new kernel exploit, a new jailbreak, then Sony knows how it's done. They patch it in the next firmware update, and then that's another hole plugged that people can't exploit anymore. So there was a vulnerability in 1.76, in 4.05, 4.55, 4.74, 5.05. They've all been patched in the newer firmware updates. So this could be one of the last vulnerabilities left to allow us to jailbreak the system. And if that is the case, then we want to milk it for all it's worth, basically. And if they keep it private, they can keep using this vulnerability to exploit all the future updates that Sony releases, which is what they've been doing. We've got a 5.50 dump, we've got 5.53, 5.55, 6.0, 6.02, 6.20, and now 6.50 has been dumped as well, all from probably the same vulnerability. And if they had released, say, 5.50, then we never would have had these dumps on the other kernel versions. It would have been patched in 5.53, and that would be the end of it. And we'd be in the same position we're in right now, because right now we're all on 5.05, and we can't play newer games. We can't play Spider-Man or Red Dead Redemption 2 or Resident Evil 2 or any other newer games released after 5.05. We're basically stuck. And that's the exact same position we'd be in if these developers released the 5.50 exploit when it came out, or when they figured it out. They released it, they gave it to the public, they gave it to us, they were like, here you go, PS4 community, here's the exploit, have fun. If they did that, then 5.53 would have come out and Sony would have patched it, because if the jailbreak's public, then Sony, it's publicly available to Sony, so they'll know how it's done, they'll patch it, and then 5.53, 5.55, all these other kernel exploits wouldn't be possible, because Sony would have patched it in the 5.53 update, and then we'd all be stuck on 5.50, and we wouldn't be able to play Red Dead Redemption 2 because it requires, 6.02 or something. We wouldn't be able to play Resident Evil 2 Remake or any other newer PS4 games, and people would be in the exact same position we're in now, asking for a 6.50 jailbreak, so they could play newer games. So yeah, that's the problem. But because they've kept it private, we now have basically a jailbreak on 6.50, and it's private, but when it eventually gets released, we'll be able to run much newer games than we would if they released it a year ago for 5.50. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that they're keeping this private. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Because at the end of the day, this jailbreak is not a very good jailbreak as far as jailbreaks go. There are much better jailbreaks for like the Nintendo Switch, Xbox 360, PS3. These consoles the jailbreaks for those consoles were much, much better, because they allowed us to run custom firmware. We could write custom firmware to the device and boot directly into custom firmware, bypassing all of the system's security, basically. So even when new firmware versions came out that maybe patched the vulnerability, if you were still on an older kernel and you were able to boot into custom firmware and write custom firmware to the device, then you could just update that custom firmware to the higher firmware version, and you would still be able to run all the latest games and everything on your jailbroken system. But the way this PS4 exploit works you have to boot into original normal firmware first, then exploit it through the WebKit, but that's only temporary until you reboot the system, and then it's back into normal original firmware again, and you have to exploit the system every single time you restart it. Therefore, it's very easy for Sony to patch it, because they just release a new firmware version that's patched the exploit, and if you update to that firmware version, because you initially boot into the normal firmware, then there's nothing you can do. You're stuck until they release another kernel exploit for a higher firmware version. That's basically the situation we're in. So it's definitely not a good jailbreak as far as jailbreaks go, but it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. I mean, Xbox One, am I right? The only way that this exploit's actually going to get released is if Sony patch it themselves. If Sony figure out what the vulnerability is and then they patch it in the next firmware update, then there's no reason to keep this private, because at that point people won't be able to go on PSN, because of course it's patched, so there's no chance of people ruining PSN, and there's no way to actually exploit the system anymore, so you're not going to be able to use the same vulnerability to exploit future firmware updates. So at that point there is literally no reason to keep it private. So that's when you can expect to see it get released, but that'll only happen if Sony figure out what the vulnerability is and patch it, or if one of the developers tips them off to what the vulnerability is and then they patch it. Either way, that's the only chance we're going to have of seeing this exploit be released, because as long as all the new firmware updates that Sony releases from now on are still vulnerable to this exploit, then they'll keep it private so that they can keep exploiting every new firmware version that Sony releases. So that is just the way it's going to be. So I guess people can just hope that Sony will figure it out and patch it themselves, and other people can hope that they don't figure it out so they can keep exploiting the system and we get newer and newer jailbreaks eventually. Actually, that's not the only reason. There's another chance that this will be released if another vulnerability is found. So if these developers find another vulnerability that's completely separate to the vulnerability that's used to exploit all of these kernel versions, then they might release it, because then they have a backup. So if this one gets patched because they released it, then they still have another vulnerability they can use to exploit future firmware versions. So that is another possibility. If they find another vulnerability, it's completely separate, then we'll see one of those vulnerabilities be released, one of the kernel exploits be released. Whichever vulnerability is most likely to get patched, I guess, will be the one that they would release. But yeah, it doesn't look like that's the case at this point. So yeah, that's basically the situation we're in, guys, and it does kind of suck. Hopefully this jailbreak will be released at some point in 2019. I'll keep my fingers crossed. I am on the community side, you know, in this. I do want a newer jailbreak for sure. I'm definitely, but at the same time I can understand why it's being kept private, and it makes perfect sense. So yeah, I see both sides of it for sure, but I would love to have a newer jailbreak on a higher kernel version, absolutely. But yeah, up until then, 5.05 still relevant, god damn it. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and once again, I'll see you guys hopefully in the next video.